Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating journey through Scripture?
Always.
Today, we're going deep into the book of Numbers.
Oh, numbers.
Yeah, specifically chapters 7 through 9.
Okay.
We're going to be uncovering some pretty powerful themes, like faith, obedience, and something I think we all struggle with sometimes, God's timing.
It's interesting because the source material we're using for this deep dive,
Oh, yeah.
it's laid out like a podcast script itself.
Whoa, how meta is that?
Oh.
It's like we're getting a behind-the-scenes look at someone else's deep dive.
Exactly.
But don't worry, we'll definitely bring our own unique perspective to it. So if you've ever felt that, like, nagging impatience while waiting for things to work out, maybe waiting for a sign or that perfect moment, this one's for you.
For sure. These chapters and Numbers, they're packed with powerful imagery and symbolism, and they offer guidance for navigating those uncertain times.
Okay, let's jump right in. Chapter 7, it kicks off with this incredibly vivid scene. The leaders of each of the 12 tribes of Israel, they're bringing these offerings to the tabernacle.
Right.
And I'm not talking about just, dropping a few coins in a collection plate here. This is extravagant giving on a whole other level.
Yeah, the sheer scale of these offerings is really highlighted in the text. 89 verses, can you believe that? Covered wagons, oxen, everything they needed to keep the tabernacle running smoothly. It was huge.
89 verses, that's like a serious chunk of the text.
Oh, yeah.
There's got to be a deeper meaning here, right? Beyond just the material value of all this.
Oh, absolutely. Each tribe, led by their leader, they stepped up to contribute. It wasn't about just the stuff itself, but their eagerness, to show respect, sacrifice, and devotion to God.
That's super interesting when you think about WHY, such extravagant giving was so important to them back then. Because back then, resources, they were hard won. It makes you wonder what this level of giving reveals about how they understood God's provision.
That's a great point. Their generosity, it could be seen as a response to God's blessings.
Yeah.
And a recognition that everything they had ultimately came from Him.
Yeah.
It challenges us to examine our own attitude towards giving.
Yeah.
Do we see it as an obligation or like a joyful act of reciprocating God's generosity?
Right. It totally shifts the perspective. Instead of what's the bare minimum I can give, it's more like what's the most heartfelt way I can participate.
Exactly.
So we go from this massive, collective display of generosity to, at the end of chapter 7, a much more personal moment. Moses enters the tabernacle to commune with God.
Yeah.
And there's this, striking description of the mercy seat.
Right.
Between the cherubim. It's painted as this sacred space, the designated spot where Moses could actually hear God's voice. So what exactly was the mercy seat?
Well, the mercy seat, it was positioned right on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and it served as this symbolic representation of God's presence, a place of atonement. It was believed that God's presence would manifest between the two cherubims. It was this point of contact between the divine and the human.
Wow, it really creates this picture of an intimate space, a place set apart for communicating with God. It makes me think about the spaces we create, either physically or mentally, where we feel most connected.
That's a really good point. Do we, in our modern lives, have, those kinds of designated spaces for reflection, for prayer, or just spiritual connection?
It makes me think about my favorite comfy chair tucked away in this quiet corner. It's where I go to think and to process and sometimes just to feel a sense of peace. Do you have a space like that?
For me, it's my study. Surrounded by, books and research, it often becomes that space for me. It's where I can really delve into these complex ideas and try to find clarity in all the information.
Surrounded by knowledge and wisdom. I like it. Okay, so moving into chapter 8, we kind of shift gears here. We go from this grand collective display of generosity to this more focused look at, light and service.
Yeah.
Chapter 8, it starts with God giving Aaron very specific instructions on how to light the 7 lamps of the tabernacle.
Right.
Each lamp strategically placed on this sacred candlestick, symbolizing light and purity in God's presence. It's interesting how light is used as a symbol across so many different faiths, representing knowledge, guidance, even holiness.
Yeah.
But here it seems really closely tied to the concept of service, especially through the Levites.
Absolutely. The Levites, they're reaffirmed as wholly dedicated to God. They were chosen to help the priests and to maintain the tabernacle.
And there's this one detail that caught my eye. It's God had a retirement plan in place for the Levites. They were called to serve from ages 25 to 50, but after that, while they could still help out, they weren't obligated to serve in the same capacity.
That's so interesting. It really raises questions about the balance between service and rest in a life devoted to God. It kind of suggests that even in dedicated service, God values rest and acknowledges that our capacity for service changes over time.
Like a divine acknowledgement that we're not meant to burn ourselves out, right? It's about finding the sustainable rhythm of service and rest,
Right.
recognizing that different life stages might call for different levels of participation. Okay, now let's move on to chapter 9. We encounter this command tied to remembrance and liberation, the Passover.
Even after leaving Egypt, God commanded the Israelites to keep observing Passover. It became this annual reminder of their freedom from slavery, a testament to God's faithfulness in rescuing them.
It's amazing to think that this tradition has lasted for thousands of years. Jewish people all over the world still celebrate Passover. It's a powerful example of how faith and collective memory can endure.
And what's really fascinating in chapter 9 is this recurring motif of the cloud. That cloud of the Lord resting over the tabernacle. It acted as this visual guide for the Israelites.
Oh, yeah.
When it stayed put, they stayed put. When it lifted, they knew it was time to move on.
That image of the cloud is so powerful. It's like their GPS, through the wilderness. When it moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. Can you imagine having that kind of tangible sign leading the way?
Right. It really emphasizes their complete trust in God's guidance, doesn't it? Their willingness to surrender control and follow his lead, even when the path ahead was totally uncertain.
This whole idea of waiting for the cloud to move, it really resonates with me. I think we've all been there, right? Feeling lost, unsure which way to go, wrestling with a decision, waiting for a sign, or just that feeling of restlessness, we should be doing something, but we're not quite sure what.
It's so easy to feel that pressure. In today's world, everything's so fast-paced. But the Israelites' example, it reminds us that sometimes the most faithful thing, the bravest thing we can do is actually wait, to trust that God's working behind the scenes even when we can't see the whole picture.
But waiting, it's not passive, right? It's not just sitting around twiddling our thumbs. How do we actively wait on God's timing, especially when it feels like, society's telling us we always have to be on, always doing something?
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
And I think the Israelites, their experience can offer some insights. First, they had the shared sense of purpose. They knew they were all in this together, united by their faith and their journey towards the promised land.
So it wasn't just Moses calling the shots. They were a community, supporting and encouraging one another as they waited for God to reveal the next step.
Exactly. They weren't going through this alone. And then secondly, their trust in God's guidance, it wasn't just blind faith, it was based on experience. They had witnessed God's power and faithfulness over and over again, right? From the plagues in Egypt to the parting of the Red Sea.
So their trust was built on a history of God showing up for them. They learned to recognize his voice, his presence, even when things were uncertain.
Exactly. And that's something we can cultivate in our own lives by reflecting on those times when we've felt God's presence or seen him working in our lives. We can strengthen our own trust in his timing.
Looking back to move forward, recognizing those moments where we felt God's guidance or provision, and remembering that he's still working, even when the path ahead seems a little blurry.
Yes. And the Israelites, they also practiced remembrance. The Passover celebration, it served as this yearly reminder of God's faithfulness and their own story of liberation. It was a tangible way to anchor their faith, to reaffirm their trust in God's promises.
It was a way to actively engage with their faith, not just something they thought about once a year. I wonder if that kind of active remembrance is something we're missing today.
That's a good point. The Israelites, they show us that remembrance. It's not just passive reflection. It's about actively engaging with our faith, celebrating God's presence in our lives and, anchoring ourselves in those stories that have shaped our beliefs.
So it's about finding ways to make our faith tangible, connect it to our daily lives, our experiences, whether it's through personal reflection, communal rituals, or just taking the time to acknowledge God's presence. These practices, they can help us stay grounded, especially when we're waiting on God's timing.
Absolutely. Now, in chapter 9, we come across a situation that really puts this whole idea of trusting God's timing to the test. Some Israelites weren't able to participate in the Passover celebration when it was supposed to happen.
That seems like a pretty big deal, right? Passover was central to their faith, commemorating their freedom. What happens when life gets in the way of following this crucial commandment?
Well, this is where we see God's mercy and flexibility shining through. Through Moses, God provides a solution, a second Passover, a chance for those who missed the first one to still participate a month later.
Like a divine do-over. Recognizing that sometimes life throws curveballs and we need a little grace to get back on track.
Exactly. It highlights the fact that God isn't this, like, rigid, unyielding being. He wants us to participate in these sacred observances, but he gets it. Life can be messy, unpredictable.
It's a beautiful reminder that God meets us right where we are. He sees our unique situations and makes a way for us to connect with him, even when things don't go according to plan.
But it also shows how important it is to seek guidance when we're facing tough choices.
Yeah.
Those Israelites, they didn't just assume they were out of luck. They went to Moses, explained their situation, and looked for a solution.
They didn't let circumstances define their faith. It's like they were saying, okay, this didn't go as planned, but I still want to honor God. What can I do? And in doing so, they opened themselves up to this incredible act of grace.
That's such a powerful lesson for us today, isn't it? When we hit roadblocks, setbacks, maybe feel like we've messed up or missed an opportunity, we can still seek guidance. Talk to God, ask for clarity, and be open to the possibility that there might be another way forward.
It's a reminder that we don't have to have it all figured out. We can ask for help, admit when we need guidance, and trust that God will meet us in those moments of uncertainty.
And there's another interesting detail here. Even though God offers this second chance, he's very specific about how it should be observed. It underscores the importance of following his instructions, even within this act of flexibility.
So it's not like, okay, you missed it, just do whatever. There's still structure, a divine blueprint, to follow.
It shows that God is compassionate and understanding, yes, but he also values our obedience, our willingness to honor his commands thoughtfully and carefully.
It's this beautiful dance between recognizing God's mercy and grace while also striving to follow his guidance. It requires humility, attention to detail, and a willingness to trust that God's ways are ultimately the best for us.
And speaking of timing, it's a theme that keeps coming up, right? From the Israelites waiting for the cloud to move to the second Passover, this concept of timing seems to be at the core of these stories.
It's like this constant thread reminding us that we're not really in control. There's this bigger plan unfolding, and sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is surrender to that plan, trust that God will reveal the right path at the right time.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
As we continue exploring, I encourage you to, really pay attention to how this theme of timing plays out. It shapes the Israelites' lives, and it offers valuable lessons for our own faith journeys.
Okay, deep divers, buckle up. Things are about to get even more interesting as we keep going through Numbers. Through all these chapters of Numbers, one image that just keeps popping up in my mind is that cloud.
The cloud of the Lord, right? Such a powerful visual. This constant presence of God's guidance, protection, leading the Israelites.
Your wilderness GPS. It moved, they moved, it stopped, they stopped. Imagine that kind of clear sign.
And like we were saying earlier, that image, it means a lot for us today too.
Yeah.
When we face those big life decisions, or just feel antsy, like we're meant for something more but not sure what.
Totally. It reminds us that sometimes the strongest thing, the most faithful thing we can do is just wait. Trust that God's working, even if we don't see the whole picture yet.
But waiting on God's time, it's not passive.
Right.
Doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing.
Exactly. It's about actively seeking God's guidance, listening to what he might be saying, getting ready for when that cloud finally does move.
Learning to tell the difference between what we want to rush into and what God's perfect timing is.
Because sometimes we get so caught up in our own plans, our own schedules, that we miss those little hints, those nudges God's giving us.
We might try to make things happen before God's given the go-ahead.
And we see that all through the Bible. Going our own way, ignoring God's timing, it usually doesn't end well.
But when we surrender to his timing, trusting that he knows the bigger picture, even when it's confusing to us, that's when we tap into something way bigger than ourselves.
Like opening ourselves up to possibilities we'd never come up with on our own.
And then when we do take that step of faith, aligned with God's timing, we can move forward with confidence, knowing it's not just our own ambition, but we're walking in step with something divine.
There's this really interesting part in chapter 9. It highlights not just the waiting, but being ready to move when God says so. Remember when that cloud lifted from the tabernacle, that was the signal for the Israelites to pack up?
Yep.
It specifically says, even if it lifted in the middle of the night, they broke camp and followed immediately.
No messing around.
Wow, talk about commitment. They were so in tune with God's leading, so ready to move when he said move. Didn't matter what time it was. They didn't snooze on God's call.
They were alert, willing to put God's direction above their own comfort.
Really makes you think, what clouds are we missing in our lives, Because we're too busy, too distracted, or just stuck in our routines. What opportunities are we letting slip by because we're not noticing those nudges God's sending?
That's a powerful question to ask ourselves. It's a challenge to be that aware, that ready to respond to God's leading, even when it throws our plans off or it takes us out of our comfort zone.
It's something I'm definitely going to be thinking about. Learning to recognize God's timing, it's a journey. But the rewards of walking with Him, those are incredible.
They are. When we align ourselves with His timing, we're tapping into a source of wisdom, strength, unlike anything we could do on our own.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Numbers, chapters 7 through 9, I think that's the big takeaway. Let's cultivate that attentiveness, seek God in all things, and trust that He'll reveal the right path at the right time.
And be ready to move when that cloud lifts, even if it takes us in unexpected directions. Because God's plans for us, they're always good, always for our benefit, even if we don't see it right away.
So, deep divers, keep seeking, keep listening, and keep trusting the one who's got the map to your journey. Until next time.